Well, we've looked at the religious dimension of the Theosophical worldview, tried to explore to some extent what may be meant by that of the religious dimension, considering man, of course, as homo mysticus then, that there is this aspect of the religious dimension we can call the mystical, which is indeed the sense of the non-speakable, the non-utterable, and yet a dimension, as I suggested, in which there is a movement through stages, if you like, which are called by Fowler at least stages of faith, which I think is a pretty good name for it. And yesterday we looked very closely at, I hope rather closely, at the philosophical dimension, and suggesting that there is indeed a way in which we can begin to explore the fundamental dynamic ideas or principles, the dynamism within the system, which gives rise to concepts from which values inevitably develop, so that we saw the relationship between our knowing, which is the modes of knowing that we have, of those essential dynamic ideas. Certainly today, there is much more emphasis on a multidimensional mode of knowing, not simply knowing, in other words, which we call left brain knowing. There is a holistic knowing, there is right brain knowing, there is the left right brain together, and it's being suggested, in fact, that it's not simply one or the other, but it's the union of the two, the linkage of the two, that produces, as it were, a third always. This, I think, is what I meant by the dialectic, that it's not simply dialogue at one-to-one, but a dialectic in which a third arises, a new perception arises. And so tonight I want to, in this final meeting with you, to explore what I call the scientific dimension of Theosophy. We're so accustomed, of course, to thinking and rejoicing about the rapprochement that seems to be developing between contemporary science, particularly physics, and the Theosophical worldview. We get all excited, and we are constantly looking at developments in contemporary science and seeing whether or not they match, as it were, the Theosophical worldview. But it's not that area that I want to talk about. A lot has been written. In the American section, we have a journal, the Theosophical Research Journal, which deals with this. Comes out, I think it's every other month or something like that, and deals very specifically with this. Basically written, the articles by many of the members of the society who are skilled in the various disciplines of science. And it's a very interesting journal. If you're not familiar with it, it's published, of course, at the headquarters of the society. It's the Theosophical Research Journal. And it helps us to see where the Theosophical worldview is indeed coming into the whole scientific world. But what I want to look at tonight is not that kind of relationship that is taking place between Theosophy and science, but rather to suggest that there is a scientific dimension to the Theosophical worldview. HPB, very early on, in fact, in 1886, differentiated between occult science and exact science, as she called them in her time, and reserving for this term exact science what we generally think of as science. When I use the word science, immediately there comes into our minds certain technicalities. Isn't that right? And many of us say, oh, I'm not a scientist, and so we don't understand, you see. And reserving for the word occult, then, she defined it as the study of that which alone can furnish the key to the mysteries of nature and unveil the problems of the universe and of psychophysical man. So she added, the true occultist is acquainted with no single problem that esoteric science is unable to solve. Quite a remarkable statement, you see. So it's what she was suggesting is that there is a realm, there is a dimension to the theosophical worldview which deals with which brings to light the underlying keys, and that those actually lie within the human being. That is to say, that there is a scientific discipline by which we can understand, as she puts it, the psychophysical man, but also that we can understand the nature of the universe. That there are laws which bring about observable results. Now, there are many ways that we can begin to approach this. And so I'm going to try to approach it from quite a number of different ways. There's another aspect, for example, in which we can regard theosophy as science. And that's what we can call the theosophical discipline, if you like. I think it's hinted at in the Key to Theosophy, in the Mahatma Letters, and in many other theosophical works. It's made explicit, in fact, in the opening section of the Key to Theosophy, when HPB stresses, you remember, that this term, theosophy, is not a new term, that there was the theosophical system of one of the greatest of the Neoplatonists, almost the final one in the school of Neoplatonism, Ammonius Saccas, in the 2nd century A.D., and that there was in that school an emphasis on 3 aspects. One, the first aspect dealt with the reality underlying the whole universe, the underlying reality. The second aspect dealt with the nature of man in relation to that ultimate reality. And the third aspect, she said, she defined as theurgy. And I think it's a very interesting point that she makes there, because, of course, theurgy is indeed, you can translate it as the work that brings about a wisdom which is divine, or a divine work, if you like. In fact, we can, you see here, under the exact sciences, we can begin to list a number of them, which I'm not going to do right now, but the physical sciences, life sciences, even human sciences to some extent. Under the occult, then, we have theurgy, or as it came later to be, alchemy, which was a particular process by which change took place, visible change. And so she makes a very strong point that this science, theurgy, was as rigorous in its formation of consciousness in accordance with occult law as any of the so-called exact sciences. That Indeed, as she defined it, it was producing a work of the gods. It was a creative work, in other words. And she said further, the term is very old. It was a mystic belief, practically proven by initiated adepts and priests. So it's provable, but we become the test object. It's provable in our lives that by making oneself as pure as the incorporeal beings, that is, she said, by returning to one's own pristine nature, pristine purity of nature, man could move the gods to impart to him divine mysteries. It's a marvelous statement that by bringing about a condition in ourselves, and this, of course, is going to lead us eventually to yoga, as I promised last night, but I don't want to come to that just yet. Now, the discipline, then, is very much present in, then, the whole theosophical worldview. It is not simply a religious dimension, a philosophical dimension, but it has its knowability, which is science, skio, to know, its knowledge, its knowability in terms of a transformation of consciousness, which is, of course, what is meant by theurgy or alchemy. We can then, I suggest, begin to see that there may be a kind of structuring of the scientific knowledge in a hierarchical way. And so I have suggested it here. I don't know why I've put things from the bottom and we're going up, but that's all right. Usually on boards one puts things at the top and goes down. But I wanted to start with this sentence, which you probably have all read, and I'll come back to it. But we can begin to see the sciences then in a hierarchical way. We can begin to structure them. The physical sciences are certainly among the exact sciences. Here in the physical sciences we have physics, chemistry, and so on, you see. The life sciences are also capable of being explored according to what we may call exact science. That is to say, biology, morphology, genetics, and so on. These are all the life sciences. You can fill them in. I'm not going to have to fill them in for you. Generally, these are the two great divisions of the exact sciences which science recognizes. Now there is coming about a kind of opening in this towards the human sciences. And it's very interesting, for example, in such a science as psychology, which is, of course, one of the human sciences, that psychology had its beginnings in the last century in really measurable stimuli, response, and so on, in the measurability. And only in this century, along with the breakthrough in physics, which suggested that there are realms which are really not so measurable, psychology also underwent a profound change, particularly brought about by Freud, of course, in the recognition of an unconscious which has a great deal of influence on us, and then, of course, into other psychologies as they began to develop, following upon that. The so-called, the followers of Freud, particularly Jung, and then on to what has been called the third force in psychology, transpersonal psychology, humanistic psychology, and so on. But it had to start as though it were part of the exact sciences. But it now has moved into, psychology itself has moved into at least exploration of other realms, particularly through ESP and so on, the exploration of extrasensory perception, which obviously was not always measurable in the same manner, and so began to open up, I suggest, towards a field which we can call the spiritual sciences, or what H.P.B. called occult science, where there is indeed, and we'll use her term from the Key to Theosophy then, Theurgy, very specifically in that field. Now, what characterizes all of these is indeed a kind of methodology, a method which has become known as the scientific method. That is, that it's testable, verifiable, repeatable, measurable, and so on. But ultimately, behind that is a method that posits a particular theory, a hypothesis, which can be experimented, which leads to certain results. Sometimes known, sometimes unknown. So what characterizes all of this is a discipline, a methodology that is inherent in both of these. Now, very often, some hardcore materialist scientist will say the methods of the physical sciences and life sciences are not applicable, therefore, to the human and spiritual sciences, and therefore these are not sciences. But look at this particular definition. This is a definition by Dr. Willis Harman, who is president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I think it's a rather interesting definition. Science is not a description of reality. It's not descriptive, but it's a metaphorical ordering of experience. In other words, the metaphors that we use to order the experience that come to us are really, the central word here, of course, is that it is an ordering. And this leads us back to a method that is orderly, that is meaningful, that has a kind of progression to it. And so I think that very definition begins to strike a note in us, doesn't it? That we're not describing reality as it is, but we are ordering our experiences of reality. We're ordering our experiences of existence. And we do it metaphorically. It's not an exact. There's a marvelous work by a physicist from the University of Minnesota who has spoken at the Crotona School, a very interesting work called Physics as Metaphor, and suggesting indeed that the fundamental elements of physics, space, time, mass, number, are not realities but metaphors for what happens in the visible and manifested universe. That they are metaphors that we have used, and we think they are things, therefore, but they are not. A very interesting book, which I highly recommend to you. Dr. Roger Jones is the author, and it's a small paperback. Roger Jones, Physics as Metaphor. The recognition that we are dealing with words that become metaphors, and we take the word as the reality. And we continue to do that. The most famous phrase about it is that the map is not the territory. And of course anybody who has looked at a map and thinks that he knows therefore precisely what the territory is going to be like, or what the road is going to be like, finds out that indeed the map is not the territory, you know. And until you have driven the road, you really have not experienced what the territory is like, have you? Simply looking at a map does not at all tell you what the whole terrain, the environment, is like. You have to drive the road, don't you? And then you can say to another one, well, on the map it looks like it's straight, but there are a lot of, turns in it and curves in that road, and be prepared to go slow at that point because you'll come into hills or mountains or whatever, you see. You look at
Potholes.
potholes too, yes, yes. And so, and detours, I always say the most famous road builder on the North American continent was a great Frenchman by the name of Detour. And of course, wherever you go, you find, he's been there before you, hasn't he? You say. And so it seems to me that we can begin to approach it then from another point of view. So much for that. Now, before I come back to this, or go on to this, let me just point out that, of course, science has indeed become the paradigm of knowledge for us moderns. And I think we may not realize that up until about the 16th, 17th century in Europe, the language and therefore the paradigm of knowledge and the language that was used was the language of religion. It was religious language. And only from that period onwards and most particularly, of course, in the 17th and 18th century, from the age of rationalism, as it was called, age of reason and so on to today, our language has changed. It has markedly changed and is now a scientific, technological language. Science has become, indeed, the paradigm of knowledge for us. We can ask then, what does this knowledge tell me about myself, about my place in the cosmos, about the whole point of my being, and about the direction of my knowing or the sense of my doing? Science, of course, leads to, or perhaps presupposes, not only a physical cosmology, but also a psychological and existential cosmology. But we can ask, does science then have any spiritual significance? Does it really have some spiritual significance? When we address that question to one of the greatest scientists of our time, we get an interesting answer. Albert Einstein, whose name is certainly familiar to everyone, I'm sure, in an address given in honor of Max Planck, who was, of course, the great leader in presenting the quantum theory, Einstein said, and I'd like to quote him because I think it's a beautiful statement that Einstein made, "In the temple of science are many mansions, and various indeed are they that dwell therein, and the motives that have led them thither. Many take to science out of a joyful sense of superior intellectual power. Science is their own special sport, to which they look for vivid experience and the satisfaction of ambition. Many others are to be found in the temple who have offered the products of their brains on this altar for purely utilitarian purposes." And then he says, and this is what to me is so interesting, "Were an angel of the Lord to come and drive all people belonging to these two categories out of the temple, it would be noticeably emptier, but there would still be some men of both present and past times left inside. If the types we have just expelled were the only types there were, the temple would never have existed, any more than one can have a wood consisting of nothing but creepers. Now let us have another look at those who found favor with the angel. What has brought them to the temple? That is a difficult question, and no single answer will cover it. To begin with, said Einstein, I believe with Schopenhauer that one of the strongest motives that lead men to art and science is escape from everyday life with its painful crudity and hopeless dreariness, from the fetters of one's own ever-shifting desires. A finely tempered nature longs to escape from personal life into the world of objective perception and thought. This desire may be compared with the townsman's irresistible longing to escape from his noisy, cramped surroundings into the silence of high mountains, where the eye ranges freely through the still, pure air and fondly traces out the restful contours apparently built for eternity. Now that's one of the greatest scientists of our age. And it's a magnificent statement, isn't it? That there are, in other words, those few in the temple of science who have come there because of a desire to see a wider vision, who are not content with just the mundane, ordinary, everyday existence. I think in that statement, Einstein, of course, revealed his own motives for pursuing science, a longing for freedom from merely personal life and a search for the world of objective perception and thought. Toward the close of Einstein's life, when he wrote a brief biography, which is really very remarkable biography because it's very sparing of any real knowledge, any real facts about his life, but it was a kind of intellectual autobiography. He points out that even when I was a fairly precocious young man, the nothingness of the hopes and strivings which chase most men restlessly through life came to my consciousness with considerable vitality. By the mere existence of his stomach, everyone was condemned to participate in that chase. And of course that's true. That's, I suppose, what keeps us all working, isn't it? It's the mere existence of our stomachs that incline us to do something in the world, for which we hope there will be sufficient recompense that we can keep our stomachs relatively quiet and filled, and etc., etc. Moreover, he says, it was possible to satisfy the stomach by such participation, but not man, not himself, insofar as he is a thinking and feeling being. As the first way out, there was religion, which is implanted into every child by way of the traditional education machine. But it's also that this religious paradise of youth was only a first attempt, he said, to free himself from the chains of the merely personal, from an existence which is dominated by wishes, hopes, and primitive feelings. Out yonder, there was this huge world, and it was that contemplation that led him then, which beckoned him, he said, like a liberation. And I soon noticed that many a man whom I had learned to esteem and to admire had found inner freedom and security in devoted occupation with it. So it's rather interesting, you see, Einstein viewed science then on a very large scale. It concerned itself for him not only with the nature of the physical world, not only then with the physical and life sciences, but with the fate of man, with existence, with ultimate reality. For Einstein, science was not just a workaday occupation, but it was a way to pursue transcendent aspirations, a way through which he sought to understand what he called the secrets of the old one. Marvelous phrase. On one occasion he remarked, "It is, of course, universally agreed that science has to establish connections between the facts of experience of such a kind that we can predict further occurrences from those already experienced. I do not believe that so elementary an ideal could do much to kindle the investigator's passion from which really great achievements have arisen. Behind the tireless efforts of an investigator, there lurks a stronger, more mysterious drive. It is existence and reality that one wishes to comprehend. Existence and reality. And this, of course, then, touches upon occult science, the spiritual science, from existence. What is existence? And behind it, what is reality? So that it was this that really, you see, here is Einstein, I'm quoting him because that is our paradigm, isn't it, of science today. Of Max Planck, Einstein said, "The state of mind that enables a man to do work of this kind, that is, of the kind that Planck did, is akin to that of the religious worshipper or the lover. The daily work comes from no deliberate intention or program, but straight from the heart." On another occasion he said, "Certain it is that a conviction akin to religious feeling of the rationality or the intelligibility of the world lies behind all scientific work of a higher order." So I think it's clear that Einstein was motivated by a feeling of awe, of mystery, a feeling which in another context he called a cosmic religious feeling. So we have to begin to see that there is more than we see with our ordinary eyes in the approach to science. Our seeing in terms of the usual mechanisms of science in the external approach with scientific instruments is extended but not transformed. Our organs of perception may be enlarged but not necessarily cleansed. So in science, change of vision comes about through a new theoretical formulation which provides a different point of view so that the same facts are now seen in a new light. But seeing in science is basically interpretation. This becomes more and more apparent, of course, in contemporary physics, where most of the experimental work is performed using instruments which no longer simultaneously involve the object seen in our eyes. We infer many things indirectly about the object, and we have confidence in what we infer because of a logical consistency. But self-correction also exists in, of course, normal science, exact science, if you like. Reality, as revealed by science, and as this is just another way of saying what I've put there, reality as revealed by science is not directly experienced by feeling or sensation, but it is indirectly conjectured by thought. And so this leads us, I think, to this point that there is an intersubjective verification that is subtler and more qualitative than quantitative measurement or statistics. And so I think that this leads us back to what we can call the occult sciences, the spiritual sciences, you see. And this is being recognized today by a number of physicists and a number of other scientists in other fields. As I say, I'm not concerned with the relation of theosophy to science. There's been much written about that, and as I say, we have a journal in the American section which addresses this constantly. You should really be having that journal here. It occurs to me you don't have it on your shelves, the Theosophical Research Journal. But you should have it because it's an outstanding journal. I don't even have a copy of it with me, I'm sorry to say. but it's something that you should see, and you can get it through the headquarters at Wheaton, Illinois, of course. So now, if the change of vision, actually, if seeing in science is basically interpretation, and this has been true from the time, you can say, when the apple fell on Newton's head, whether that was metaphorical, allegorical, or literal, you see, or from the moment when Archimedes rushed out from his bath through the streets of, shouting Eureka, because he had suddenly come to this illumination of how to weigh the crown, which he had been asked by the emperor, who was, of course, a very stern fellow, would have had his head if he couldn't have weighed it, and he suddenly discovered how it could be weighed by taking, when he was in the bath and he noticed the water rise again above the level of that ring around the tub. Quite obviously Archimedes nor his wife never cleaned out the tub, and so the water rose, and he realized that his body displaced the water, and that's the easiest way to measure something. From any of these times, seeing was indeed interpretation of events. Therefore, I suggest that it is necessary to look very closely at what we mean by seeing, a change of vision, which comes about not through a fussing with the furniture of the world, if you like. A transformation of vision does not come about simply by building new and better instruments, although that may enable you to see, for example, with some of the telescopes now, and radio telescope and radio astronomy and so on, we now can hear stars before we see them. We now have access to a wider range of our universe through the various instruments that have been developed, yes. But the seeing, the interpretation, the genuine change of vision can only come about through a transformation of the investigator himself, and hence of his organs of perception. We become both the instrument and the object of our scrutiny. The method is the same. The method is observation. The method is using now the instrument of ourselves. And in perfecting this instrument of ourselves, we at the same time extend and deepen our field of observation. So what is needed for objective perception, to really see what is existent, you see, in order to arrive at then what is the ultimate reality, what is needed is freedom from oneself. And the spiritual aspirant then escapes the personal self, not by ignoring it, but by attending to it with total honesty, and thus establishing a consciousness which is independent of it, and which, unlike the turbid medium of personal consciousness, is capable of becoming directly aware of the presence of the non-personal, or we can say the suprapersonal and intrapersonal self of the self. The instrument, then, is the whole man. We are our own instruments. And that undergoes a process of transformation brought about by, if you like, the suffering often entailed in the facing of one's own inner contradictions, and the subsequent voluntary subordination of the personal self to the greater self discovered within. The perceptions involved in internal knowing, the seeing then, those perceptions are direct and immediate. Understanding here, of course, includes poetic and intuitive insight. And so far from being opposed, as we have long thought, to scientific and rational knowledge, it opens up even vaster and richer dimensions of reality, adding significance to science itself. It seems strange, I think, in the light of what I'm saying, that men of very good sense should regard the internal and external paths as opposing each other, you see, rather than as mutually supportive and complementary. But there are an increasing number, even among the scientific disciplines, who are recognizing that the internal and external paths are complementary, mutually supportive. I call your attention to such people as Dr. David Bohm, for example, who's been so greatly influenced by, and is, of course, one of the leading exponents of the whole philosophy of Krishnamurti, and certainly is one of the great scientists of our time, but recognizes that the internal and external are complementary. After all, the domain of nature includes what is inside man as well as what is outside, doesn't it? So the spiritual aspirant's concern to know himself and the scientist's concern to know the world may be thought of as the estranged halves of a primordial unified search for knowledge expressed in the ancient idea that man, the microcosm, mirrors in principle the macrocosm. How can we know ourselves without recognizing our relatedness with the rest of the cosmos? This is very important. And what point would there be if we knew all about the stars and yet knew nothing essential about ourselves directly? I think probably the major cause of the imagined opposition between the two paths lies in the different faculties involved in the change of perception. In both cases, there is a firm conviction that reality is not as it appears to our ordinary senses. In the external approach of science, the change of vision is brought about primarily through the agency of reason, whereas in the internal approach it is brought about mainly through that whole aesthetic dimension of knowing. Goethe, for example, called mysticism a dialectic of feeling, while science is a dialectic of reason. But Einstein remarked, in a man of my type, the turning point of the development lies in the fact that gradually the major interest disengages itself to a far-reaching degree from the momentary and merely personal and turns toward the striving for a mental grasp of things. So I think wisdom really comes in this reconciliation of the opposites. It's an integration, then, of the intellectual and the mystical, if you like. And therefore, this is why I brought science at the end for this 3 series. I think we can see this in yet another way, if you like. We can begin to recognize that there is, if we can call it, that which is the true, that which is the ordering principle, which we talked about last night, logos, which expresses itself in 2 ways. One, through that which is worthy, the arete, or the good in Platonic terms, or the worthy, as I called it also last night, and the beautiful, or metron in the Greek, which is the beautiful, which is the right proportion. And it is the relationship between the good and the beautiful that leads us ultimately to recognizing that principle, just as it is that principle which gives us the good and enables us to perceive the beautiful. And it seems to me now we begin to have a pattern that puts together the three. And perhaps in the center is Sophos, wisdom. Or we can see it, if you prefer, as indeed the good and the beautiful in their relationship, revealing themselves in the universe as the true. And I'm sure you recognize the interlaced triangles.
Yes.
And so we can look at it in either way, that from that ordering principle we derive that which is both metron and arete. And it is their relationship between what is the good, and we are now recognizing, you see, for example, that in knowing the right proportion of things, metron is beauty is the right proportion, that there is revealed the value, and both then leading to that. But also it is that relationship which leads us to what is the true in the world around us, or from the existent to reality, dipping into the realm. Now, how do we then move towards the transformation of our consciousness? HPB used the term theurgy, as I've mentioned, but we can also use the term yoga. And as far as Einstein, for example, was concerned, we can say for confidence that for him science was indeed a spiritual path, a path which indeed was a path to the knowing, in which he became one with that which was known. And so, if you like the Western term from Neoplatonism, theurgy, or if you prefer the term which is often used instead, yoga. And of course this is then that way in which there comes about the transformation of consciousness. Yoga then, because it is simply, to use the Sanskrit terms, chitta, vritti, nirodha. And see, we have probably a Sanskrit scholar here, and I should not be attempting the Sanskrit. That's an N-I, I'm sorry. Chitta, vritti, nirodha. Many, many translations of it. Many translations. The thinking principle, I think one has to be very, very careful with its translation. This is my own view about it, that this is the thinking principle, this is the cognizing principle, that which perceives, conceives, not the faculty of cognition itself. Vritti, its transformations, that it constantly takes on what it looks at, that it constantly is in motion, it is constantly moving, and constantly reflecting, as it were, as in a mirror, all that it sees. And that has to be brought to a standstill. Often that nirodha is restrained. I think we have to be careful of it as it's the cessation of these transformations. It's the cessation, or the bringing under the, into an ordering. It's bringing about this logos principle of an ordering of chitta, of the cognizing principle, so that it's not subject to all of these constant transformations. I find many, many different translations. I find many different ways of expressing it, and our friends here who are from India may have better translations. You want to say anything?
I know what you said is right. It means the cessation of the process of thought.
Yes, it's the process. It's not cessation of thought. but of the transformations which the thinking principle undergoes. Would you say that that is correct? So therefore, what the first steps, which I think are so interesting, and of course there are, of course, in classical yoga, 8 limbs, which are in a sense simultaneous, not so much one after the other, as indeed all necessary, fitting together as a whole. The 8 limbs are angas. I'm not going to give you a lecture on yoga, I assure you. First of all, time doesn't permit. But I think it's so interesting that Dr. Taimni, for example, who was himself a scientist, he was a professor of chemistry for many, many years at Allahabad University in India, should title his translation and commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, who was, of course, the great codifier of yoga, the science of yoga, that it is a science. I knew Dr. Taimni rather well, once had quite a discussion with him, because he wanted, at the time that I had been asked to reopen an educational center at our world headquarters when I was the vice president there, and I had been asked to get it started again, what had been called the School of the Wisdom, and which is now again called that. During my time at Adyar, I called it the Center of Theosophical Studies, because I wanted it as a kind of open-ended investigation. And Dr. Taimni came to me and he said, "Joy, you must call it the Center of Yogic Studies." And I said, "Oh no, Dr. Taimni, that will be misunderstood in the Western world, and we'll have all the people from the West and the United States and Europe and so on all coming over for the lessons in Hatha Yoga or in the asanas and pranayama and so on, and thinking that that's all there is." And he said, "Well, that's just why you must call it that, so that you can correct that view and get to genuine yoga." And I said, "But it really is theosophical studies I'm after." And he said, "But what else is theosophy but yoga?" You see, it's the same thing from his point of view. I must say I won out on that, since it was my enterprise, and consequently it became the Center of Theosophical Studies. But it was fun, because Dr. Taimni was a delightful person. He was a short person. He was sort of an elfish person, and with very big ears, sort of like an elf. It was wonderful. But he was really, of course, he was a brilliant man, very delightful to discuss things with, and really quite brilliant. So what I'm suggesting simply is to point out that it is as we've already said, and as many scientists are now recognizing, the work that is to be done in the interpretation is in how one sees, how one views what one sees. That we may look at things in different ways. And we have to work at what is the seer. Who is the seer? Who is the consciousness that so long as our occupation, as it were, our concern is with the instruments that are external to us, sort of fine-tuning those instruments, we will not come to a genuine knowing. We will not come to that metron, which is the beauty that is revealed in the universe, the right proportion that is there. We will not be concerned with the worthy, the good, the values. And you hear many scientists say, we're not concerned with its usefulness or its good or its value. But we can do this, we can manipulate the world. But rather that our perception must be now cleared, our seeing, the consciousness must be transformed. That freedom from oneself is a necessary prerequisite for apprehending reality as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. If we would really come to know freedom from one's own personal subjectivity is not brought about by appealing to a collective subjectivity which remains an extension of oneself in a horizontal plane, but it's a wholly different dimension, a totally different dimension. And this brings us, in a sense, full cycle to religion again, doesn't it? Do you see? That at the heart of it is indeed this metaphysical position, if you like, which I talked about last night. At the very center of it is that, you remember. But which is manas. You remember on the first night I suggested that we were discussing the triple evolution of man, you see. You remember we had that on the board here. The triple evolution, the spiritual or monadic, which is expressed through the monastic, which must now be grounded in, expressed through, made visible by. The witness is in the physical realm of our daily existence. The central point always is manas, that is, the consciousness within. Mind that is clear of all impedimenta, all obstructions, and hence the first of the great limbs of yoga is always spoken of as yama, usually translated the restraints, the manner in which one lives, the way in which one conducts oneself, which is, of course, complemented by the niyama, or the observances. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's rather interesting to note them, because there are 5 aspects to yama. Ahimsa is the first, usually translated as harmlessness, but it's not just that, it's that one's whole life is without injury to any living thing, and everything is living, without any injury whatsoever, at any level. The second is satya, which is usually truthfulness, but truthfulness which arises because one perceives that which is essential in all externals. I think they're very interesting. The third is asteya, which is usually no misappropriation. We do not misappropriate what is not ours. We do not take what is not ours. Often, simply not stealing, which is simple enough. I mean, we may not take somebody's purse, but we may take away somebody's reputation. We may slander and speak ill of another, which is a misappropriation. Gossip is misappropriation, if you like. Very much so. Because it is misappropriating, taking away from, appropriating to oneself what isn't one's own. And we engage in that. As brahmacharya, freedom from craving of sensual pleasure, but it's that we do not waste any vital energy. Nothing that is the vitality of our being is not just dispersed, it's not wasted, it's channeled, as it were, it's given a direction. And aparigraha, a non-possessiveness, that we're without greed, which doesn't mean just, greed for chocolate sodas, but that we become greedy people. We're greedy for knowledge. We're greedy for context. We become sort of vampires on each other, that we need, each other. There is we do need each other, but we become greedy in our need. And so we take, and we misappropriate the energy of another. And how closely these all fit together, you see. Well, one could go through all of these various steps and begin to explore them in depth. But what is aimed at is a transformation of consciousness. a bringing about of a condition in which consciousness is now not swayed by all of the whims that pass through it, you see. Chitta vritti nirodha. Well, as I say, I'm not going to go into further detail. One does move to the so-called observances, niyama, purity, contentment. Do we accept ourselves as we are and accept situations as they are? Because we have to start with that acceptance of ourselves, and acceptance that recognizes, that is honest about it, and a self-discipline, tapas, which literally means heat, which is a warming, which is a kind of heating up, as it were, a kind of bringing ourselves to a boil, so that all the impurities can be skimmed off, if you like, you see. With a constant brooding, svadhyaya, self-study, a reflection, a constant interior brooding, and then a recognition that we are indeed moving on this way, Ishvara pranidhana, a surrender to the highest, to that creative principle, Ishvara, within us, that creative principle which can birth the new, bring about the new, and then one can move to the other limbs of yoga, concluding, of course, with that mind which is established in its own self. The seer abides in himself, brings about a condition where the seeing and the seen are one, where there is no distinction between the seer and the seen. This, it seems to me, is the scientific dimension of Theosophy. It is a work of the gods. It is a Theurgy. It is a bringing of oneself into a pristine purity of being where one can perform the work of the gods. Every action is indeed a work of the gods. That is, it is creative, truly creative, renewing. And this is not the easiest of the disciplines, of course, not at all. But this is what the Theosophical worldview aims at. And that brings us back to the religious dimension. It's a beautiful circle, you see, beautiful circle, in which the religious dimension is revealed then through the scientific, if you like, and the focus is indeed in that metaphysical position which we delineated last night of non-dualism, and all that flows from that, the ordering principle. Well, I think that we ought to have some discussion, questions, whatever. Yes, Ernie.
Is this the point that Blavatsky was trying to get across when she mentions the word genius?
I think so. Probably so.
That it's a jump in consciousness?
It's a jump in consciousness. It's a leap in consciousness, yes. I think so.
So what you were describing this evening really is genius in the scientific.
In the scientific, yes. And that's why I think there is no one who exemplified this for our time. He became, as it were, the exemplar of this than Einstein, which is tremendous in the scientific paradigm that we have. Steffi, you look like you're really puzzled on that.
No, I'm really thinking.
That's good.
My ears are working for me to look different.
Oil them?
Are you perflinking? Does this begin to make sense of these? It's a new way of looking at the whole theosophical worldview, I think.
Well, a lot of it makes me think of one book that Manly P. Holt wrote, which is the Man, the Grand Symbol of the
Yes,
Universe.
man, the grand symbol of the universe. You see, which is the same thing as what I've been saying. We ourselves become the test object. And the provability of the whole system, you see, and this is what HPB gives as the first point in her summing up of Volume 1, in which you might expect that she would repeat or reiterate the first fundamental proposition, but she doesn't. She says there that this whole system, this entire view, has been it's provable because it is the result of, and it arises out of, the fact that countless generations of seers have been made to prove this for themselves. So the experiment is repeatable. You see, many people say, you see, that all of these things, they're not measurable. What is measurement? What is measurement?
That same bunch of seers
Mm-hmm.
is sitting here listening right now
Mm-hmm.
and say a little about their influence on an audience like this.
Well, I think this is very true. VJ has pointed to the fact that these seers, we have sometimes called them Mahatmas, masters of wisdom and compassion. Those who have really cleansed consciousness, who have performed this yoga of transformation, and their presence is with us. Where two or three are gathered, there am I in their midst, which is a very true statement. And those great ones, however, who call themselves brothers, do not refer to themselves as anything other than as brothers, because they are in that relationship to wisdom which is philos, Sophia. Brothers, therefore, you see, they are in a filial relationship with genuine knowing. So they are the true philosophers, if you like, you see. And therefore their presence is with us. Yes, I certainly agree. And it is their example that we may follow. The door is open always to him who knocks. It has never been closed at any time. And HPB makes this clear, doesn't she? So do the Mahatma letters. Make it very clear. To those who approach us, we are there. Storm the gates of heaven, if you will, you know. In a famous letter from the Master K.H. to C.W. Leadbeater, force any master you will. And how is it forced? By the life that is led. Very clear. In the K.H. letters to C.W. Leadbeater, for example.
Well, it's quite obvious that K.H. tried to influence Sinnott to an extent where he would change his ways.
That's right. He said, I can't approach you if you're going to live in a certain way. The odor of brandy is too much, you know, and so on. There are very interesting passages, aren't there, in that regard. But I can come nearer to you, but you must draw me by a purified will and a purified heart and a gradually developing will. Yes. So it's very true.
You can really feel the cries of K.H. telling Sinnott.
Yes, yes.
If you want
this,
and there was the desire there from
yes,
Sinnott.
that's right. But he couldn't give up the things that were necessary. He couldn't bring himself to really completely go forward. And
For those of us who have been more in league with the left-hand path in other lives, we're going to have to be aware of the tuck-over back out of where we are trying to get. Now, that applies in many cases, and the pull is too strong and they fall away.
Yes.
That's my interpretation.
Yes.
And to those who still persist, anytime you step out of line, you know it.
Yes.
And
This is the self-correction.
Yes, this is your self-direction. It's constant. It has to be that.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever it is, even if it's a sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
you let it go. You don't
Yes.
grab it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be one
Yes.
stipulation.
Mm-hmm. But you see, it's also, I think, incumbent upon us to realize the importance of, for example, the teaching of Shankaracharya, who was, of course, the great exponent of Advaita, the non-dualistic system of knowing, the Advaita Vedanta. And one finds this in Plato, in the Western tradition. One finds it in the Buddhist tradition, in Tsongkhapa, the great Buddhist reformer of the 14th century, again and again, that our humanity is not by chance, and it's very easy to lose our human status. Now, this doesn't mean that we are going to reincarnate as animals. Plotinus, for example, in his commentary on Plato, and Proclus in his commentary, is that this is a metaphor for the fact that we really can lose what humanity we possess. We can fall back, and it only means that it's a kind of metaphor that we become, take on asses' heads. I mentioned Lucius Apuleius, for example, and we can enter into that kind of animalistic
there
life.
are historic factors.
Yes.
People, historic characters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know whether this is, I don't know where I got this from,
Mm-hmm.
but Bismarck had a choice of
Mhm.
right or left-hand path. I don't know whether you ever heard that.
I have heard
But he
it.
chose what he did,
Mm-hmm.
purposely.
Mm-hmm.
He had the option.
Mm-hmm.
Also, even Hitler
Yes.
had the option.
Had the option.
You see, he was shown where he should go,
Where yes.
even to the making of the
Mm-hmm.
Flying Cross.
Mm-hmm.
He made it to rip rather than to for
Mhm.
peace.
Yes. Yes. But the
So-
choice is always there, and it never becomes, we may think, well, I'll wait another time. It'll be easier another time. It's never going to be any easier than it is right now. Never.
On the other hand, what they did
Mm-hmm.
was just as necessary for the people they dealt with,
Yes.
bring them up to a certain degree, even if they themselves had to
Mhm.
stay back and lose ground.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Very
they
often.
know
Mhm.
what to do. They
Mhm.
know where to go. When I've got this
Mm-hmm.
lousy job done, I can get back up here, and I'll take the karma that's involved,
Mm-hmm.
and these people will start to rise by
Mhm.
virtue of what I've done. Is that a logical way to look at life?
That has been suggested as a way that there may be a sacrifice involved in taking on. There's a very interesting saying in the Christian scripture, for example, that it appears, I've forgotten how the full statement is, but that evil has to come, that there has to be this pull in an opposite direction, as it were. That Judas was necessary. And the statement is made, but woe unto him through whom it cometh. In other words, that individual will, of course, pay the price, but it has to come, and there has to be the channel for it. It's a very mystical and a very difficult concept to really grasp and understand. I think one of the most interesting efforts to really cope with this was Carl Jung's work, Answer to Job, which is a very, very difficult work to understand fully, but and brought down on Dr. Jung's head the ire of the Catholic and Protestant churches, both, because of his psychological interpretation. But it's a magnificent work, his Answer to Job. I recommend it if you're at all interested in the psychological aspect of this.
There's a saying that you should never condemn your enemies, but
Mhm.
to thank them.
Yes, yes.
But does
No man is my enemy. All are my friend. All are my teachers.
good and evil has to fit into the non-dualistic
Yes, of
system.
course.
It must.
It has
And in
to.
that sense, isn't evil a different expression of good in
Yes,
some way?
in many ways. Yes, the
It's
shadow side is
necessary.
necessary.
It's complete.
hmm hmm this is not always easy for us to accept. Not by any means, but we have to accept our own shadows. In the realm of fantasy literature, there's the marvelous series by Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea series, and the very first one, The Wizard of Earthsea, in which the hero is confronted by this dreadful blackness, great, from which he flees, from which he runs and every effort to escape it, and finally turns around and calls this by his own name, and then it is dissipated. It's a marvelous. It's one of the.
It's a wonderful writer.
It's a wonder. Oh, Ursula Le Guin is an absolutely marvelous writer, and very.
I was thinking tonight when I was looking at your first definition, how interesting it is that it could also be a definition of literature.
Yes.
It could also be a definition of art.
Yes, yes, this is true. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope I've given you something to think about and ponder over and explore, and perhaps a new way of looking at all of this.
Are you sure there are no more questions? Don't be shy, this is your last chance. Well, I'd like to thank Joy extremely much for giving us these 3 evenings where she's expounded on Theosophy as religion, as philosophy, as science. I think we've all gained enlightenment through these 3 talks, and with the use of the video equipment that we have, we'll be able to make them go over and over and over again until we know everything perfectly. Then we'll be able to go down to Cortona
And tell me where I went wrong.
and tell Joy where she went wrong. I'd like to thank you personally, and on behalf of Edmonton Lodge, and on behalf of Mercury Lodge as well.
Thank you so much.